Welcome to Instant Deck Techs. The aim of this series is to give you a short, concise guide on how to build a certain deck. It won't cover every card, but we'll go through all the categories and go over the types of cards needed to make the deck work. Any card mentioned will be down in the description below. The commander of this deck is Octavia, Living Thesis. It is 8 blue for an 8/8 legendary creature, Elemental Octopus. This spell costs 8 generic less to cast if you have 8 or more instant and sorcery cards in your graveyard. It has Ward 8, which means whenever Octavia becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, counter it unless they pay 8. It also has Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, target creature has base power and toughness 8/8 until end of turn. The aim of this deck is to combine instants and sorceries with cheap evasive threats, which with Octavia out will then become lethal beaters. In order to get Octavia out as quickly as possible, there will be a slight self-mill theme in the deck, but it won't be all in, and we'll be playing these effects on cards that we already want in the deck. This will be seen most notably on our card draw spells, where things like Careful Study, Mental Note, and Thought Scour will be very good. Early game, they'll draw us through our deck to allow us to get Octavia out nice and early. Then late game, there'll be a cheap way of turning something into an 8/8. After those, the rest of the 1-drop card draw spells will do a very similar job. I would honestly want to run as many of these as possible. Having so many of these in the deck will mean that we can chain them together so they can either help us draw some additional win conditions, or in the late game, with our commander out and some evasive creatures out, these will then become our win conditions. There is a place for some higher costed card draw spells. More is more in a deck like this, and blue has the best selection available to you. And while not an instant or sorcery, it's hard not to mention Archmage Emeritus. It just synergizes with everything the deck is trying to do and will really help us draw a ton of extra cards. Then lastly with card draw is Coastal Piracy effects, basically effects that draw us cards whenever we deal damage to a player. As we'll be running a large amount of low drop evasive creatures, we can turn that damage that they do into card draw with these. It is still very important however to run the low drop instants of sorceries that we've gone over. These will just help take us to a new level of card draw. Next up is Evasive Threats. With our commander out, any instants or sorceries that we cast will turn one of these into an 8/8 beater. What you're looking for in this section is a really cheap creature with either flying or that is unblockable. The best ones this deck will have an additional effect, so things like card draw, being able to scry. You have things like Siren Stormtamer, which will give some of our other creatures protection. Hypnotic Siren can be bestowed onto Octavia as well to make it a threat in the air. All these will do work in the deck and aren't very expensive. The next tier of these threats is ones with just a kind of evasion. In total, we're looking for between 8 and 16 of these, and this will depend on if you're running the token makers that we'll get to in a moment. As time goes on, they'll continue to print more cheap evasive creatures with cool abilities, so as they do, things like Flying Men might get phased out of the deck. Next up is some token makers that'll play really nicely with all those instants and sorceries that we'll be running. I'd personally only want to run the ones that make evasive threats, so Murmuring Mystic, Talrand, Docent of Perfection when it flips over, and Shark Typhoon. There are other effects out there that do a similar thing, but they don't make evasive creatures. While they'll still do work in the deck, they won't be anywhere near as good as these, because the added evasion will be very important. Moving on to our interaction, we want to keep the bulk of these on instants and sorceries. Blue is a good selection of creature removal, so I'd pack them into the deck. When it comes to board wipes however, blue doesn't have much in the way of permanent removal, but has a good amount of mass bounce spells. As a load of our creatures are really cheap, we can easily play one of these late game and then replay all of our board. And we can't talk about a blue interaction section without mentioning some counterspells. While we won't need these to protect our commander from any targeted removal, our board wipe however will really ruin our day, so I'd look to keep these and the mana up to stop the Wrath of Gods and the damnations that are out there. Our ramp will mainly come in the form of mana rocks. Outside of Soul Ring, I primarily want the rocks to tap for blue, as we have a lot of low drop spells that cost a single blue. As well as those, you can also run some creatures that tap for mana. In this deck, they'll let us ramp ahead, while becoming a threat later in the game with our commander out. Cards like Millikanen and Deranged Assistant can also help us with the self-mill, so we can get Octavia out that little bit earlier. If you want to go a bit bigger with your mana, then you can look at Extraplanar Lens, Gauntlet of Power, and Caged Sun. These should give us an obscene amount of mana, and if you're running the higher proportion of expensive card draw spells, then these will get even better. And then in a deck with so many islands, we can run High Tide. Say this when you have a big board state, and when you want to cast multiple spells in a turn to turn them all into 8/8s. Okay, let's move on to some ways of winning the game. First up we have Runechanter's Pike. We can attach it to our commander, or an evasive threat, to bump up the power and the amount of damage we'll be able to throw around in a turn. Next up is some ways of giving our commander evasion. Opponents can't take too many swings from Octavia, and these will make it all the much harder for them to deal with. When looking for these, I'd look for effects that either draw us cards or are repeatable. If you're feeling a bit more horrible however, we can also run some infect spells to kill our opponents even quicker. Grafted Exoskeleton in particular, combined with the buff of our commander, makes any unblockable creature a lethal attack. On the horrible train, next up is a card I hate, and that's Cyclonic Rift. If you're playing this card, think of it as a win condition, not a board wipe. If you're having to play it to save yourself, all you're doing is extending the game. Think of it as a win condition. Play it out when you have a board state, bounce your opponent's things before your turn, so you can have all your mana up to turn all your creatures into 8/8s. Onto some more fun win conditions. With all the ways we have to draw cards in the deck, we can weaponize that with things like Ominous Seas, Nadir Kraken, Chasm Skulker, and Psychosis Crawler. And then I'm also putting Future Sight into win conditions, as if you can get it out and can untap with it, you should be drowning your opponents in value. This deck is running so many cheap spells that it's really easy to chain through a really powerful turn with this out. Moving on to some utility lands, as we're a monocoloured deck, we can get away with running quite a few. Look for things that interact with instants and sorceries, things that make creatures unblockable, draw us cards, or things that can become creatures. As with these out, we can turn them into 8/8s when we need to. The rest of your mana base will be very dependent on what you have available to you. We've recently released a video with some advice on building a deck with a budget mana base, which might be of help. Until next time, please like, share and subscribe, and let us know down in the comments if there are any commanders you'd like to see a deck tech on. Thank you very much for watching.